Hello, dear colleagues. So I start my paper, which is about memory of the siege, emotions and material remains. In my paper, I am concerned with the issue of emotions as the drivers of the vernacular memory practices. I am dealing with the materials which reveal the cases of establishing memory out of the recollections and scattered thoughts, making the material memory artifacts out of the immaterial past. I argue that the materialization of memory, or more precisely the process of its materializing, is a crucial act of reinterpretation of the past related to and dependent on the personal emotions and their shift. I work with the oral history materials collected within the joint project of the European University at St. Petersburg and the Museum of the Siege of Leningrad. I will start from the description of the case, will follow with my questions, and then will attempt to speculate on the issues of emotions and establishing the memory of the past. So I will begin with a really brief description of the case of Siege of Leningrad, because I'm not sure if all the audience of this conference have any knowledge about this. I hope so, but anyway. So the Siege of Leningrad was among the most dramatic events during the World War II. It lasted from September 1941 until January 1943, when the city was circled by the Nazi troops and was totally isolated from the mainland. Millions of people who remained in the city, mostly women, children, and the elderly, suffered from mortal famine. The entire urban infrastructure was destroyed. People didn't have water, electricity, heating, sewerage, and ground transportation. Every day, dozens of townspeople died on the streets, and their corpses could not be buried for several months. About 40% of the Pribo city population died during the siege, predominantly from starvation. This was about 1.5 million people, while the total number of the victims is still unknown today. There are several books written about the history of the Leningrad siege, and among them are the books by Nikita Lomagin, who is also present in this panel, and by Lisa Kirschenbaum, and the book by Alexis Piri about the siege diary, and some others. The memorialization of the siege started already during the war years, when in 1943 Leningrad Authority undertook the organization of a special exhibition dedicated to the heroic defense of Leningrad. It was opened just several months after the siege had been lifted in 1944 and was reorganized into the museum in 1945. The museum received an extraordinary success among local people, but already in the beginning of the 1950s, its activity was shut down because of the purges among Leningrad party elite. In 1953, it was closed, its funds and materials were partially destroyed and partially passed to the other museums. The history of this museum is not written yet, but you can find some information again in the book by Lisa Kirschenbaum and also in some Russian language publications. On the way of general social, political, and memory liberation in the Soviet Union at the end of the 80s and beginning of the 1990s, the initiative to recreate the museum was announced in local press and was supported by Leningrad administration. The museum was established on the original site also, with a limited space and in the situation of a total shortage of the museum funds and financial support. In order to fulfill the existing deficiencies, the museum organizers called on Leningrad people, inviting them to bring the material objects, diaries, memoirs, photos, and any other materials related to the siege. The campaign resulted in a huge materiality flow. People brought pianos, wardrobes, books, pictures, helmets, spoons, letters, family archives, and so on and so on. The museum staff was limited to a few persons who were not able to interview or even talk with the donators. Consequently, all those objects had neither personal history nor any historical or family context. The museum received a grandiose memory property, consisted often of the strange things whose relationship to the siege past was unclear and often not evident. Together with the colleagues from the Museum of the Siege and my students at the European University of St. Petersburg, we initiated in 2016 and 2017 a short-term project on interviewing those people who donated various materials and objects to the museum in recent years. And I would like to appreciate here all my students who worked with me within that project, and namely Anastasia Pavlovska, Alexey Pavlovsky, Gulnaz Galeva, Alexandra Voronina, and Darina Zuyva. The initial question of the project was just why. So why people do this? Why people brought and still go on bringing their personal belongings to the museum? I start from the assumption that people always have a choice. They can do nothing to memorialize the past, and they have a range of opportunity to memorialize it if they want. So what are the mechanisms which make people choose museum form of memorialization? After reviewing the official museum documents, so-called the Acts of Donations, we discovered that lots of donators were too young to be the siege survivors. The discovery implied two-sided paradox. In certain conditions, the survivors and eyewitnesses of the siege preferred museum to their descendants as a better and more appropriate venue for preserving their memory. To the other hand, the descendants of the siege survivors also preferred museum in certain conditions as the best repository for their family archives and artifacts. Even more surprising was the discovery that several gifts were not the siege artifacts at all, but were recently created by the donators. Why? Why, the decades after the end of the war, some individuals decided to create the objects associated with the siege? So now I turn to my material and do some discussion of them. We usually think of memory as a cast of the past, either good or bad, interesting or not, politically engaged or not, commercially successful or not. The widespread metaphor of material memory is souvenir, which we take with ourselves to keep memory with us. Family relics, which are carefully preserved in doll boxes or chest of drawers, implicate similar idea of privatization of the past. But in the case of the siege memory, the situation is different. People do not take things for themselves, making the part their personal belonging. Instead, they create the reality of the past by refuting their possessions. The majority of the gifts carried to the museum had not been the family relics in a literal sense. For example, Olga, 60 years old woman, brought her grandfather's diary to the museum in 2016. She found it in the cupboard with kitchen silver utensils. Other war documents and letters of her parents were kept in different places in the apartment. Here's a fragment from her interview. I'm extremely sorry that I can't show you the fragments from the interview, and it may be really difficult to hear them without seeing, but I will try to read slowly. So, the researcher, could you please tell whether this family archive was always considered in such a way as family archive? Olga responses. They, she means parents, they did not pronounce such words. This is me who takes it as a family archive. Well, there were some papers lying, just lying. Well, there were just some documents. They could keep them in the same way as, in fact, they kept them with ordinary invoices. Nobody said, attention, be careful with this, preserve this. Absolutely. It seems they did not care about the future. Who and when will read this? They did not tell. We did not know that there were some letters and so on. This is rather common story. People have some stuff for years, but one day they discover it is something meaningful and valuable. When Olga found the diary, nothing happened. According to her words, she just took a look and understood that the text was written by her grandfather, who died when she was 4. Many years later, she suddenly, and now I quote, she thought that this mess was outrage, that it should not just lie. At that moment she bought the file folder, sorted the pages out, and put them into the files. The time passed, and once she felt that the file folder was not enough, and now I quote again. I thought, no, there is something not good there. And one moment I was struck. It was occasional thing, emotional thing, because I am not well-organized person. And one moment I said to myself, you're playing a fool right now, watching the detective when you should at least 1 hour per day pay to transcribing this. The end of the quote. She started transcribing the diary, which was bad handwriting, and it took a lot of time to finish the work. Some years later, she decided to carry the diary to the Siege Museum. She relates this decision to the idea that people should know about the siege, and she should tell about it with the materials she has. And one more quote. I believe, that is what Olga said, I believe the blockade should stay on the same level with Holocaust. They should stay alongside, and people should tell about it. The end of the quote. Applying the approach of Igor Kopatov to the biography of things, we can see that the gift of the diary to the museum was not one of the events in the biography of the memory artifact. Rather, it was the moment of its birth, interpreted as emotionally loaded and creative act of memorialization. Another story is about Yelena. She is an old woman in her late 80s. She donated dozens of various war documents to the museum, for most part her husband's diaries and photos. Yelena's husband died some years ago, and she still keeps his belongings untouched on their places. Aside from the photos already have been donated to the museum, she kept hundreds of pictures made by her husband. In her collection, she had a lot of copies of the same photo. In many cases, she did not know people on them, and often she did not remember the names. Also, I apply here the term collection. It may be misleading. Yelena did not perceive it in this way. Scattered all over the apartment, folded in different envelopes, packs and boxes, this was not her family archive, but a bulk of memory with which she did not know what to do. She could not throw it all away, and I quote her words, and I suddenly could neither destroy nor. There are also people who buy up, but this I could not do. I will give this all to you. The latter case brightly illustrates another condition of memory practice. While Olga wished to give her grandfather's diary a voice in a big history, Yelena wished to get out of a memory load. Also, she repeatedly claimed her inability to throw the objects out. At the same time, she did not want to possess them. I quote, I have not thrown them out, but it is very heavy for me to see them once and once again. It is very heavy, she explained. In almost the same words, Olga told about the reaction of her elder sister toward the documents of their grandfather and parents. I quote, the sister said, imagine, I can't touch these papers. I can't. It's too painful. I can't read them. Let me bring this back to you. Both Yelena and Olga's sister do not want to be the owners of these objects and physically need to pass them to someone else. Yelena asked interviewers to tear the photos, delegating them the right to decide what pictures are worth of preserving and which ones are to be destroyed. The division line between useful and useless objects is vague for donators. Will you take this? Asked Yelena. She also told about the museum associate who planned to come to acknowledge the documents and to make them legal. This line existed for all the donators who had to select what was relevant for the siege past. Another person, another case, Mikhail. In his 80s, he made the oil lamp similar to one which was used in his family during the siege and gave it to the museum. This was a very small object supplemented with a brief manual. When the everyday life of the people in the besieged Leningrad had dramatically changed, people started to adjust uncustomary things to new functions. The shortage of warmth and light stipulated searching for new resources, and handmade oil lamps became really widespread. When the blockade began, Mikhail was only 10. As he emphasized in the interview, it was not him who constructed the original oil lamp. He called it using the diminutive "Kaptilochka." Because he was too young at that time, I quote, "I have only thought up to reconstruct it and to give it for all people could see." For him, the handmade oil lamp was a symbol of human ingenuity, craftsmanship, and mastery, which he associated with the siege past. I quote, "The blockade is unlimited volume of knowledge about human behavior and such a tricky mastery to scrape the floor of the loft or to extract linseed oil from the paints, such an ingenuity." End of quote. Michael graduated from the Electrotechnical Institute, and all his life he has been working as engineer. He wanted to tell the world about this extraordinary ability of besieged people to invent things having nothing in their hands. Michael told that he didn't think about the museum when he decided to construct the lamp. I quote, "I wanted it to remain, just to remain, and only later I understood that it is necessary to donate it." The word "to remain" is crucial here. Also, Michael had nothing from the past. He wished to create something for the past, to materialize it, to make it visible and sensible. Similar to Olga, Michael wanted to tell other people about the blockade experience, but he has never discussed that time with his mother, who did not want to remember it. He tried to talk with his children, but believed he had failed. I quote, "I tried, but anyway, who did not see will not be able to understand." The war veterans, he said, did not used to tell about the war. I quote, "They understand each other. They do not need words. But it is impossible to explain to all the rest." End of quote. And in the end of the interview, he concluded again, "To tell about this, there is no sense in it. It is not necessary. Not necessary." This inability of survivors to tell about the traumatic past is well known in Holocaust recollections and is rather typical for the war veterans. But what is unusual here is an attempt of Mikhail to tell without words. His way of speaking is making. He decided to construct the lamp instead of words, making the past material and visible. In all the cases presented above, the memory artifacts were not the memory objects which people brought to the museum. Instead, the people invested new meanings to their belongings, making them the memory artifacts through the procedure of interpretation, selection, and negotiation. But that was not enough. They also felt emotional necessity to physically take part in production of the memory objects, investing their efforts, time, and professional skills. Not only Mikhail made the lamp by his own hands, but also Olga transcribed her grandfather's diary, believing it was her obligatory duty. The materialized memory artifacts, created through the process of negotiation between the personal recollections and envisioned model of proper siege memory, do not serve as a family relics because they fail to shape family identity and relationship. Rather, They sought to transform the personal emotions through establishing the material remains of the memory which otherwise would not exist. Thank you very much.